Welcome to the Church Solutions Podcast, brought to you by JSL Solutions. The Church Solutions Podcast is designed to help equip you and your church in the use of technology and other tools and services. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Lacy and Phil Thompson.
We're back. It's another edition of the Church Solutions Podcast.
Hi, my name is Steve Lacy.
And I'm Phil Thompson. Good to be with you again. Steve was on vacation last week, weren't you?
That's right.
Where'd you go? We didn't do it last week.
We didn't do it last week, did we?
You were gone. You didn't want to do it from Cabo? Is that where you were?
That's where we went, Cabo.
Wow.
Went on a trip that my high school buddy arranged and ended up not going on. So everyone that he had invited went without him.
Yeah, and you're like, good riddance.
No.
Well, did you have fun?
Yes, it was a great time. My high school buddy, as I explained to my wife, that my high school buddy arranges these surfing safaris. We grew up surfing, and so now that we're old and gray, he still puts together these surfing trips. And so this one, we were going to bring the wives and make it a vacation. Yeah.
But you still surfed.
We still surfed. Yeah. He decided that he was primarily interested in a surf trip, and we were primarily interested in a vacation kind of thing. So he ended up not going.
Bummer for him, but and we interviewed you a few weeks ago. We didn't talk about your surfing experience, did we?
Well, some would say it's not a. People say, "Oh, you surfed in Texas." So,
that's right.
Yes, grew up surfing in Texas. They do have surf in Texas, not quite like the rest of the world, but
But you were in SoCal too for a while.
I was in Southern California. I was very disappointed in the whole
surfing
beach scene in California.
Why were you disappointed in it?
It was just it's mainly, it kind of goes with the Southern California thing, in that you're fighting people going, coming in the water everywhere you are, finding a parking spot, just getting to and from, and it's just, the surf was better, but then you'd have 40 people dropping in on your wave, and whereas other places you've been, you're like, oh, I can leisurely spend the whole day, get as many waves as I want.
Have you surfed in Hawaii?
I have not. I've honeymooned in Hawaii.
You didn't surf like in the North Shore?
I did not. I went and watched the North Shore of Oahu. Yeah, that's a little bigger surf than I'd be comfortable heading
my wife
into.
Almost drowned there, but anyhow, it was on one of our vacations. But I got some good pictures of her going under.
That's not hard to do, especially if you're not used to big surf. You could really get messed up.
Yeah. All right, so the real reason we do this podcast is to help churches and ministries. We are a tech company called JSL Solutions. We do streaming video mobile apps, as well as church management stuff and websites. And Steve and I have been involved in ministries pretty much all of our adult lives, and we're pretty old.
Just after the Civil War ended.
Yeah, we're pretty old, and so we talk about tech things, but there are times we divert from tech things, and we are talking today about money.
Yes, a very important topic.
Yeah, because if you're involved in your church as a leader, as a pastor, even as a volunteer, this is a topic that you might want to pay attention to, because we're going to talk about how much should churches spend on their staff.
Yes.
And you've served on church boards for a long time. You've never really been on staff. I've been on staff and on church boards.
And the senior pastor.
I was a senior pastor for about 8 years, and I've been executive pastor for many years, and still I'm working a little bit part-time with a little church of about 100 people that I'm their executive pastor. So how much money should churches spend on their staff? That's what we're going to talk about.
Right. We have the answer, right?
We have all the answers, as usual. So obviously, if you think about this, most churches, it's probably no surprise that the largest financial investment is going to be on their people, their staff. Mm-hmm. Most churches pay their staff. Now, there are some churches out there that work totally with volunteers. Good for them. If you make that work and you are good with that, and that's what you guys want to do, great. But most churches will pay some of their staff, or at least one person, maybe more, depending on their size. So it brings up a lot of questions. I remember as a senior pastor starting my own church, and as we grew, I remember asking myself, okay, well, how much money should I be making? And I remember asking several other church pastors that I knew, and it was some of these answers are consistent with what we're going to talk about today. So anyhow, should we jump into it?
Sure. So
and by the way,
go through five
key
questions,
points
right?
here. And by the way, Tony Morgan, who we've quoted here recently a lot and been around for a long time, Tony Morgan with a organization called Unstuck. The Unstuck Group, I think, is what he calls himself, but you can find him on TonyMorganLive.com. Tony's organization, a lot of these notes are from Tony, and they do a great job working with churches, and this is part of his material. So here's the question: how much should we pay our staff?
Yes. So
$10.
As little as possible, right? Especially if you're on the board.
That's right. So
if you're on staff, as much as possible.
Exactly, depending on where you're at. So there are scripture references. One of them's in 1 Timothy 5 that talks about elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well, especially those who work hard on preaching and teaching. That's the English version. There's another one about you must not muzzle the ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain, which is kind of an analogy there for, take care of your leaders, your pastor,
yes.
Whatever.
Make sure those workers are well fed.
Yeah, it says they deserve their pay. So if you go by that, all right, we should probably pay our pastors and our staff. So, the bottom line is that church leaders should be paid probably well. And if you look overall at the scriptures, it really doesn't say much about, there's not really any caution about paying them too much. I mean, there's, you don't want to abuse that stuff, but most of the warnings talk about paying them very little. So,
yes. The cautions are against paying them too little.
Right, paying them too little. So
it's hard, it's easy to err on the side of paying too little.
Right.
Like I was just advocating earlier.
Although there was a guy who I just saw in the news, who I actually met this fella, who's soliciting his members for a brand new jet. It's like a $47 million jet. It was on the news last week. I won't say his name, but his initials are Jesse Duplantis. And I actually met Jesse Duplantis many years ago, and Jesse's asking, he's already got a couple jets. He wants another one. So I don't want to get into that because I'm sure there's some people listening to this podcast that think that's a great idea. I don't, but that's,
Well, the media is going to twist whatever.
Yeah, the media is going to twist that.
The media is going to say any Christian leader is out there to take advantage of people, and
that's true.
They do not understand.
Most of the media will do that, but I do struggle a little bit with people that already have jets in their fleet, and they need more. So
it depends on. We may disagree. I'm sure there's not all the story being told.
Okay, so you're in favor of that, I guess. All right,
no, I'm in favor of the truth.
The truth. All right.
Yes.
So
knowing the whole story.
All right. So we'll move on because we don't have the facts, and that's not really what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to talk about Jesse Duplantis' jet.
So we're asking how much should you pay your
staff? How much should you pay Jesse Duplantis? How much should you pay your pastor? and so here are some answers. All right, and one of the things would be to look at what other professionals in your community make. So that's
similar. Those in similar roles,
and it doesn't necessarily have to be other pastors, although that's something you could look at.
Yeah, or similar levels of education required and experience required, and that kind of thing. I'm not sure what would be a secular role equivalent to a senior pastor.
I don't know.
That's
a good question.
One sense, they're a CEO of a small company.
You could see it that way. You could see it that way. Yeah.
I mean, that's one sense, and then the other role, they're a social worker,
right? Which don't usually make very good money.
Yes, those are two extremes, right?
Right.
So, it depends on the success of the business, but
it has to do with their roles too. I mean, and again, we'll get into this in a few minutes, but a senior pastor's role may differ a little bit from another senior pastor's role, especially when you get into other staff people. Some of their roles may be different, and you have to keep that in consideration for compensation. I would say, I think you have to look at all those things and probably look at if you can find out what other pastors somewhere a ballpark figure of what they might make with the size of church they make, perhaps.
Right.
And also, I think you need to look at the cost of living differences, because if I'm pastoring a church in Southern California as opposed to pastoring a church in Junction City, Kansas, the cost of living is much more reasonable in Junction City, Kansas than it is in Orange County or whatever. So I think you have to look at that as something, as cost of living and what all that is. So again, it's really kind of trying to get, and this is not easy. It's not an easy answer. It's not easy.
Not a quick.
It's not a quick answer, because you got to look. You got to see the picture. You got to see the big picture, and then we'll get in a little bit about percentage, because that's another thing to look at, percentage of your budget. So we'll get into that in a moment. So anyhow, I would start by looking at what other professionals are making and cost of living.
And being on the board for many years, that was, as we'll get into this as well. Mm-hmm. You're looking at the senior pastors' pay, and you want to know, are we treating this guy well? Are we paying well? We don't want to pay too little.
And his experience level.
Yeah,
and his degree, what kind of education he has.
Right.
And is he doing a good job? That's something to think about.
True.
It's one of the things I think when I worked with your pastor, one of the things we looked about was the church growing? What's the situation there? I mean, you can't just totally base it on growth, but you do need to see how well the church is doing as far as a health indicator, and how much that pastor plays a role in the overall health of the church. So anyhow.
All right. So kind of the first thing is lean towards the caution is against paying too little.
Yeah, I think that's a wise thing to consider.
So this leads into the next point. It says, what if I can't afford to pay my staff well?
Yeah, I can't afford it. I can't afford to pay them. Well, one answer to that is you may have too many staff people.
Yes, I guess there's no biblical mandate for determining how many staff, but there is a mandate for making sure that those you do have are paid well.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people say, well, you should only have one paid staff person, one paid pastor for maybe 100 people. But I don't know if that's it. Again, it just depends on the situation. So, I mean, when I started helping out this church I was with, they had 4 paid staff people and they were running 30 people. I mean, now there's a bigger picture to that I can't get into because it would take too much time, but they had gone through a lot of transition, and because of the transition, they had kept some staff and they were preparing for a larger thing down the road.
Did I talk to you about, or on this podcast, something I thought was really interesting? I listened to a guy speak, and it was in a church planting organization. We've talked about it.
I don't think we did it on a podcast, but I know you and I have talked about it, yeah.
So he made the point that, and they lead, a very successful effort for doing church planting, and they have kind of a formula together.
Right.
And he talked about, he says, you know why churches can't grow? He says, here's a typical church. They got 100, maybe 150 people, and they have one paid staff member.
Right.
And he said the problem is that one staff member can reach and draw and support maybe 100 people. And what they need to do is to grow is they need some more staff, but they can't afford that additional staff because he said if you had 3 staff members, he said they would bring in, each of them would bring if they're good
bring people in,
pastors, they would bring, they'd support 300 people.
They could take care of.
But you can't make the transition. So the formula for this guy's for planting new churches was he starts them off with 3 staff members as a plant. It's like, that's interesting.
So, again, we don't have time. We maybe ought to interview this guy or something on a podcast, but obviously they put 3 people on staff, but they've got to raise their money.
Well, it's a different money. It's a church plant, and so they're getting funded by dozens of churches in the city. Yeah. Anyway, it's kind of a unique situation. But
I understand that.
And we're talking about churches that have been cruising along for 2, 5, 10, 15 years, figuring out what their staff should be paid. So the bottom line to our second point is that there's no biblical mandate for how many staff members, but you want to pay them well. Yeah. And so you want to potentially, if you can't afford, maybe you have too many staff.
Right. Yeah.
or too many paid staff.
And then as you continue down that road a ways, you want to have people that would you might call higher capacity leaders. So you may have some staff people, but they're not. How can I say this in a nice way? They're not very productive. They're not really good at what they're doing. And the idea here is, according to Tony Morgan's organization, is maybe you've got too many staff, and maybe you've got people that you need to hire people that have higher capacity so they can raise up other leaders and build better volunteer teams.
Which means you're paying that staff member more than your typical staff member. Right,
because that person is more effective, has the ability to raise up leaders, can do more ministry, and multiply ministry, so to speak, within your volunteer corps, and then you can raise up leaders. And again, another philosophy has always been, if you're going to hire staff from people that are a part of your church, that have been committed to your church, that have some talent, that can lead. Hire those from within your church. So you could kind of, and again, we're getting off track here a little bit, but the model might be, hey, I'm going to get a really good leader who can raise up other leaders. I'll pay him well instead of paying 2 or 3 staff people that are mediocre, and get somebody really good, and he can raise up leaders. And then as the church continues to grow and do well, then we can pay those volunteers that have proven, over the last year or two.
If they're really good, talented leaders, they're going to bring in other leaders that, the volunteer rate will be higher. Right. You're going to get higher quality volunteers. Yeah. So,
And I mean, it really does. John Maxwell made it famous, who's an author and pastor and all that stuff. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And it's really true. I mean, in any business or ministry or church. And so if you can get good leaders, your church will rise. And you'll see things happen. And as Tony Morgan says here, talent attracts talent. And so if you can get some people, leaders attract leaders. And so when you raise the bar for the capacity of the people you hire, on your church staff, ultimately it's going to increase the capacity of the people who want to join your team, your church, your leadership team.
So what percentage of the budget should be committed to staff?
There you go. So that's probably something to really consider. And every church is different, obviously. And there's different churches that do different things and have different purposes and different strategies. According to go ahead.
And what's ironic is we were, we work with a business consultant, and we were talking about this question.
Right.
Just this morning about what
I was getting kind of nervous.
Revenue goes
I was squirming in my seat. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Not really, but maybe I should be. I don't know.
And this actually, this guy's not talking about the church per se, but anyway, well, let's get into it. So
same principle, yeah.
Similar principle, which I was thinking. He used the example of a landscaping company, which I was thinking, wow, that's got to be a large percentage of the cost in the landscaping company is got to be labor,
sure,
and staff, or paying for the labor.
Right. And
he was making the point. He says he's never worked with a successful company that has labor as a percentage of their cost over. He said 40%, right? I was like, even with a landscape company? But
you'd think it'd be higher.
Yeah. So
interesting. Well, according to Tony Morgan, which his organization is called the Unstuck Group, good people there, he says that in the over 200 churches that they work with, these churches invest about 50% of their overall budget on staff compensation and benefits. So 50% of their budget's going to go to staff and compensation for them and their benefits. And they encourage churches to try to stay within the range of 45 to 55% of their total budget. Now, again, there's always going to be differences. And, he said he's seen some go as high as 70% of their budget to staff. And some churches are all different. My particular church I've been helping for the past 5 years, really our mortgage is free and clear, and so we don't have a lot of facility expenses. We don't have mortgage or rent, And so, you can kind of adjust that number for that and put the money into something else.
And I think the bottom line here is you want to work with a budget that has margin in it.
Right.
So that you can afford to pay a higher percentage of the staff if you're able to reduce expenses in another area. You don't want to get to the point where you have no margin in your budget.
Exactly.
And then, summer comes or something happens and you're like, oh my gosh, we've got to lay some people off if we want to make it through the summer.
Yeah.
So you want to set a budget that's going to have some margin in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the idea. So somewhere between 45 and 55% is, I guess, the normal average. But again, everything's different.
Yeah.
So
and I guess per our business consultant person, that would be in the secular world, that would be really high.
A little high,
according
to him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. All right.
All right. So number 4.
Fourth point: should we be concerned with how other churches compensate their staff? And I kind of alluded to that earlier. It probably, as your church continues to grow, experiences good health, good growth, you probably ought to, consider, hey, what are some of these other guys doing? And according to Tony here, it might help you to stay competitive with similar churches. So the idea is if you don't, and I mean, look, let's be real here. The idea is, we're committed, we're a team, we're committed. But the idea here is that, look, the reality says you could run the risk that other churches will begin to hire away your best staff if they're willing to pay better, compensate them more than you are. So I think that's probably true. I think your church has probably experienced that.
Yeah. I think it doesn't play a significant role with the senior staff, with this
right.
senior leader, but it does play a role with all of the supporting roles in the staff.
I think that's, as much as we might, if you're in ministry around here, you might be, I don't know about that, but I think there's truth to that. I think, hey, look, everybody wants to continue to do well in life. They want to make more money. They want to, right. And so I don't think you can blame somebody that's on staff that says, you know what, I could go over here and get more money.
Right. And I'm doing the same kind of ministry and I'm working for God's kingdom and I got a different label of the church, but they're going to come, my family's going to do better.
Right.
Working over here. So there is, and I'm sure we see that.
Yeah, I think so.
So you should be aware. If you want to avoid, that problem of underpaying your staff, which is what the Bible admonishes against.
Right.
Is you should know what other people are getting paid for, the youth pastor, the whatever it may be, the facilities guy, the whatever, all those elements.
Yeah. So how do you find that out? Well, do you just go around banging on everybody's doors and say, hey, what are you paying your staff? Pastor Jim over there at the Baptist Church. And I guess you could do that, but there's some suggestions here. Leadership Network is a organization that you could find online, Leadership Network. Another one is Lifeway, which did a study for the Southern Baptist Convention compensation study. Lifeway is one. And then the other one is the Church Network, which I guess ministrypay.com. So that might give you an idea, give you some kind of an idea on where you might be able to find some information on what people
I know that in my former life, all of the salary studies are the best sellers with the magazines and stuff.
Right.
And it says,
your former life, is that karma? Is that something to do with reincarnation? Is that what your former life? You said.
Oh, my former life.
You meant your former
aerospace.
Your former occupation.
Yes, I didn't have a former life. No.
I'm trying to be funny, but so I think it's worth looking over some of those things.
The jokes go right over my head.
Well, that's
I'm sure they'll go over.
I'm sure people will pick up on it and criticize me. All right, so so take a look at what other people are doing. You might want to consider that as your church continues to grow and things continue to go well.
Yeah, and I guess you would be able to recognize it very quickly if you start losing staff.
Yeah, you start losing staff, you might say,
they're going down the street. Maybe I'm not doing too well.
Yeah.
And
all right.
then move into the mode of getting rid of some staff and increasing the pay of those.
That could be good too. Get some people that can do well. All right.
Our last question here is who should determine those staff salaries?
So that's a big question, and every church does this different. Who should determine the staff salaries? So according to Tony here, and I would agree with him on this, it should not be the congregation. The church should never be voting on line items within your budget, like the specific salaries. And again, I recognize that there's lots of churches. Our company represents. Well, we don't represent, but there are people, lots of churches that do streaming video with us and other things, and different ideas and different thoughts on how their structure is. But I would agree with Tony here. It shouldn't be the congregation. They shouldn't be the ones making that decision, and that can be a very awkward meeting if you have people voting because everybody feels like they have a say. The other thing would be
I think that would be the worst.
Oh, I'm sure
because there's all kinds of personalities out there that would say that's not nearly enough, and then others say, "Oh my gosh, that's so much. That's way too much."
Yeah. The other thing is he says he does not believe the church board should be involved in setting each individual salary. And his point on that, which again I would agree with, is because they don't really work with the staff on a daily basis, and it's hard for them to judge what everybody does, their performance and their capacity and how they do things. So his point here is that really it should be the senior pastor that has the authority to make the final decision on compensation levels for everyone on his or her team, is what he gets at. So, and again, that's kind of how my church does it. I think that's what your church has done
I support
over the
that
years,
as well.
working with those guys I did years ago.
Yeah.
So as far as a senior pastor, though, I mean, that's a little different. I think the senior pastor should surround himself with a good leadership team that's unbiased and can give him or her good feedback on what that person should be making. The
model that is in the business world, it actually kind of applies here as well, because in the business world, the board holds the CEO of the company accountable,
right.
And then the CEO is accountable for running his business, how he sees fit.
Secular world.
Yeah, in the secular world. So in the church, it's and this is what we had done for a long time as well, is the board kind of sets the senior pastor salary. And they do that by doing some of these other things that we talked about previously. And then the senior pastor then, the board may set a total salary budget for the entire church and working with the senior pastor. Mm-hmm. And then it's just up to the senior pastor to figure out, okay, this position deserves X and this position deserves Y.
This much compensation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So the leadership team or the board is the one that would help set the salary for the senior pastor.
For the senior pastor, and probably help set the total budget for salaries for the church. So that the senior pastor goes, well, I'm going to hire, everyone's going to be paid the same as I'm paid or more, and I'm going to spend 85% of my operating expenses on
salaries,
on staff. Yes.
Well, yeah, and again, we're out of time here, but I think we recognize, Steve and I recognize that every church is different. There's different governing structures and different bylaws in every church, and that's kind of what my church does. I mean, we have a leadership team, a board that approves the budget. I actually am the one that puts the budget together. I work with the senior pastor to put the budget together for everything. And then if there's raises or something, we might throw that out as far as for the senior pastor and even for staff. The leadership team for my church will look at that, and they're going to look at it and say, you probably ought to, that's fine. You should probably go ahead and give that person a raise or something, but it's more of a give and take. It's not a legalistic thing, I guess.
And in drawing, just another maybe useful tidbit was, based on my former life experience.
Not your former life, but your former life experience.
Yes, my former life experience working in the corporate world. They would, the way they would work raises, they say, oh, the annual or the average annual raise package is going to be 4%.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then you would give a 4% budget to the supervisors,
right.
and they would be able to determine, okay, this guy I'm going to pass, this guy I'm going to give 8.5%, this guy
right.
I'm going to give so.
Right.
So that's one way to handle it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always a interesting subject and can be a tricky subject, and it can be a sensitive subject too, depending on who's listening to this podcast and what your role is at your church, whether you're on the board or you're a key volunteer or you're a senior pastor or a staff person that's maybe an executive or associate pastor. These are certainly sensitive issues because you're talking money here. But I think it's worth looking into it and investigating it and being comfortable with a solution. Finding, good dialogue, good discussion, healthy dialogue, healthy discussion on these topics can lead to positive results. And so going through that is good. So we're out of time. So there you have it. So if you have some feedback on this, we'd love to get it from you. Just send us an email, support@streamingchurch.tv, because we're here to support you. Support@streamingchurch.tv. You can listen to this podcast, Church Solutions Podcast, on any podcast provider, right? iTunes and all the other ones out there. We're there. Just search Church Solutions Podcast. I think we're on YouTube, and we throw this on Facebook once in a while and all that. So, all right, we're done. We're out of time. He is Steve Lacy. I am Phil Thompson. This has been the Church Solutions Podcast. And until next week, we hope you have a great day and a great week. We'll catch you later.